Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Just to let you know, we'll get started with the presentation in about 1 minute. Hello again, everyone. Just to let you know, we'll start the presentation in about 30 seconds. Thank you so much for joining us. An official hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Safety and Health Magazine webcast, Powered Industrial Truck Compliance, Inspection Requirements Training, and Frequently Asked Questions, sponsored by J.J. Keller. This is Alan Ferguson. I'm Associate Editor at Safety and Health and co-host of the On the Safe Side podcast, and I'll be moderating today's event. Once again, thank you for joining us, and before we get started, there are a few housekeeping items. As a disclaimer, the views of today's speakers and organization are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of the National Safety Council or Safety and Health Magazine. Any mention of a commercial enterprise, product, or publication does not mean the council or the magazine endorse those items. After today's presentation, we'll conduct a question and answer session with our speakers. If you have a question, click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, type your question, and press the send button. We welcome your questions at any time during today's event. You don't have to wait for the Q&A to begin. We might not get to every question, but the good news is unanswered questions will be forwarded to today's sponsor. The chat is open for today's event, but once again, please use the Q&A button for any questions for our presenters. Also, after this presentation, you'll be asked to complete a brief evaluation survey, and I'll let you know more about that a little bit later. Just to let you know, this webcast will be archived so you can access it after today's live event. To view this webcast and all of our past webcasts, please visit safetyandhealthmagazine.com/events. You may also receive a link in our post-event email. With that, let's introduce our presenters. With us today are Gina Godine and Ed Zaleski. Gina began working with J.J. Keller's EHS content team in 2023 and has 10 years of hands-on experience as a safety manager in the construction, mining, and manufacturing industries. Her strengths and interests include writing about lockout, tagout, personal protective equipment, confined spaces, and working at height. Ed, as senior EHS editor, has been with J.J. Keller since 1999. He creates content on a variety of safety-related topics, specializing in walking, working surfaces, powered industrial trucks, and injury and illness record keeping. His contributions extend beyond the desk as he frequently addresses audiences at compliance events around the country. Gina, whenever you're ready, go ahead and take it away.
All right, thank you, Alan. Yeah, so today's webcast is made possible by the J.J. Keller Compliance Network. This platform offers a wide range of tools and resources to help businesses like yours keep up with the ever-changing regulations and expand their compliance knowledge on important topics. So features from Compliance Network include resources, news, trending issues, consulting directly with our experts, peer discussions, forums, and more. So on behalf of J.J. Keller Compliance Network, thank you for being here. Okay, so you see on your screen here, we have our agenda pulled up for you and what we're going to be covering during today's webcast. First, we're going to be talking about OSHA's Powered Industrial Truck Standard. We're going to talk through training requirements, maintenance, inspections. We'll talk some more on attachments and all of the compliance requirements that come into play when using attachments, various attachments on your powered industrial trucks. We're also going to be going through personnel lifting platforms, again, one form of attachment. And we're going to be talking about, how important it is to make sure that you are staying compliant with the regulations when it comes to personnel lifting devices. There's a lot of discussion that we'll have on that as well. And we thought it'd be fun to include some audience interaction as well, where we will be asking some engaging questions to get to know you and your unique situation. So please be on the lookout for that. We do have the chat and the Q&A open during today's webcast. And as Alan mentioned, we will have time at the end of our presentation to answer as many questions as we can. And while we may not get to all of them, we do strongly encourage you to submit those during our time together today. All right, so we are going to start out with one of our questions. We are curious. There should be a poll coming up on your screen here. But we would like to know how you currently deliver your forklift training. So we're going to ask a poll question. Please indicate your response. Do you have just one person at your company who handles all of your forklift training? And maybe you have two or three or more employees who are responsible for training. For example, some employers will use one trainer for the classroom portion and a different trainer for the practical portion. Or maybe you even hire out a third party to deliver the training for you. And then the final option is if you're using an outside third party trainer, but you also have someone within the company assisting as well. While you're submitting your response, we wanted to answer some common questions that we receive. And one of them is, do forklifts need to have backup alarms or warning lights? Well, I think the answer here may surprise you. OSHA does not actually have a requirement for forklifts to be equipped with either of these. Now, OSHA does say that if you do have a sound producing device, such as a horn or a backup alarm, it does need to be functioning. And also, OSHA cautions employers that certain operating conditions may require the use of additional warning devices like backup alarms. So it is going to be up to the employer to determine if that type of safeguard would be necessary, again, depending on the work environment that your employees are exposed to. Okay, so back to the poll question. We're getting quite a few of you submitting responses, so thank you for doing that. We have kind of a variety. A lot of people have two or more people internally doing the training. And then we have about 27% of our attendees indicated that there's one person internally. And if you're here with us today, I'm guessing that's probably you. So thank you for taking the time out of your day to be here today. We do have some people, of course, who also utilize third-party trainers, and we'll talk more in detail about the specifics around taking advantage of that option. So thank you. Very good stuff. With that, I'm going to pass it back to Ed, and he's going to get us started on our first topic.
Thank you, Gina, and thank you everyone for joining us. So, it seems most logical to start out with a discussion of the scope of OSHA's 1910-178, the Powered Industrial Truck Standard. So, what do we mean when we hear the term powered industrial truck or forklift or PIT as we sometimes summarize that? What equipment's covered? Are pallet jacks covered? What about scissor lifts? We've been asked about golf carts, things like that. So you see on this slide 7 classes of commonly used powered industrial trucks. Now keep in mind this classification does not include all PITs covered by the standard, but it should give you a pretty good idea of what's included. So let's talk about what the standard does not cover. The major exception involves earth moving equipment. I'm talking front end loaders, backhoe loaders, things like that. These are not under the forklift standard. Even if this equipment has been modified to accept forks, OSHA said equipment that's designed to move earth is not under 1910-178. Also, we've been told by OSHA that golf carts are not covered, and there's letters of interpretation stating that scissor lifts are not covered. These are generally people movers, not material movers. Now, of course, you probably want to train scissor lift operators, but it's not actually under 178. And then, of course, equipment like hand carts that are not powered. A pallet jack, for example, a non-powered pallet jack, that's not covered because, hey, they're not powered vehicles. Now, depending on the industry, the equipment might be covered under another standard. There's a construction standard on material handling equipment, for example. And of course, the general duty clause would apply where OSHA often references industry standards and manufacturer operating instructions. So, like for scissor lifts, I mentioned. So, you do want to train scissor lift operators even if they're not falling under the forklift standard. All right, with that scope taken care of, I'm going to move it back to Gina to talk a little bit about training.
Okay, thank you, Ed. Yes, sorry, trying to get my microphone working. That would be helpful. All right. So, yes, let's talk through training. First, we're going to be talking about who can and who should conduct training. And this is another one of those questions that we get a lot. Um, so, we're certainly going to be spending some time on that today. We'll also branch out and try to shed some light on a few issues that either the OSHA requirements don't address or they don't address in great detail. So, we're going to be covering all of this information. So, just what makes an effective trainer? Well, certainly they do need to know the OSHA regulations. Most importantly, though, they need to have experience operating the equipment and they need to be committed to training success and to be good communicators. So, you can certainly have someone who is a really great forklift operator, but do they really want to train others? Are they committed to the training? And then also, do they have the communication skills to transfer that knowledge onto the trainees? Many operators do, but some won't. So make sure that you keep that in mind if you want some of your operators to also be the trainers. Also, make sure to set some criteria of your own for when an operator can become a trainer. It shouldn't be just because they've operated the equipment for a certain number of years without an incident. Make sure that you've observed these operators and that you feel that they're safety minded because you certainly don't want a trainer who is going to be passing along shortcuts or bad habits to new employees or new operators. Now back to the discussion on, who can conduct the training. Well, OSHA really states that an operator has to have knowledge, training, and experience. I'm sorry, a trainer has to have the knowledge, training, and experience. So all operator training and evaluation really has to be done by somebody who meets that definition. The standard doesn't really go into more detail beyond that. It's kind of left up to the employer to ensure that the trainers meet those general qualifications. But OSHA has no requirements for trainers to take certain classes or hold any sort of certification, like a train the trainer certification. Those can be valuable and helpful, and it is quite common in the industry. But OSHA doesn't actually have any specific requirements for the trainers to be recertified at any specific intervals or to hold any sort of particular certificate. As long as they have that knowledge, training, and experience deemed by the employer, they are allowed to be a trainer. Now, the only aspect of this that OSHA has clarified, and I mentioned this earlier, is that the trainer does need to have experience operating the equipment and any attachments that they'll be training on. However, the standard doesn't require that the trainers operate these forklifts regularly, so they don't have to do that outside of their training duties as part of their regular job function or responsibility. And one more thing I'll add to that is that some trainers may not have experience with certain attachments. And in that situation, you can utilize additional trainers. Again, maybe it's an experienced operator who has more experience with those particular attachments than your primary trainer. So you can utilize more than one person to conduct the training. Now, with third-party trainers, this again is very common. Many employers will utilize third-party trainers for at least some of their operator training. And there certainly is nothing wrong with doing this. Many of these third-party trainers or consultants do have great experience in both forklift operation and training, so they are a natural fit. But make sure that you are checking their credentials, particularly considering the type of workplace that you operate in. So for example, if you are a retail distribution center, make sure that the third-party trainers are familiar with distribution centers and the types of hazards and the work environment that is conducive to what you operate in. Also make sure it's best that if you can bring the third party to do the training at your facility, that would be the best case scenario. That may not always be an option depending on who that third party is and what their requirements are. But there's several reasons for this, why that would be beneficial, and primarily because they can train on your own equipment and in your unique operations where your operators, your employees will actually be working anyway. So if you send your operators out to do, a class offsite at some training center, then keep in mind that you will still have an obligation to evaluate them in your workplace. So you still must supplement the training with truck and workplace specific training requirements. So even if you utilize these third-party trainers, you're not completely off the hook for doing training at your facility. Now, regardless of who delivers the training, specific requirements must be met, and I'm going to talk about those briefly, incorporating some common questions that we get from our customers. Now, all operators must be trained, including those operating powered pallet trucks, order pickers, stand-up units, operators of pretty much any type of powered material handling equipment, again, unless it's on that list that Ed mentioned earlier. The operators must receive a combination of training for forklift and powered industrial trucks. So it must consist of the formal training, which is, typically your lecture, your discussion. It could be interactive computer learning, video, written material, and so on. They must also receive practical training, which means demonstrations performed by the trainer and practical exercises performed by the trainee. And then finally, operators must receive a performance evaluation. So they must operate the equipment and be observed and evaluated before being considered fully trained and compliant per the OSHA standard. We'll talk about the evaluation in a little more detail later on in our presentation. But usually you would introduce the basic concepts during a formal classroom training like the OSHA requirements. And then you would use that practical part to go over the forklift controls, talk about load handling, and so on. Now, with the practical training, it's usually best to start with simple skills and then ramp up and build upon those as well. So that can be a good tip for implementing that hands-on training. And then with that, I'm going to pass it back to Ed, and he's going to continue our discussion on training. Ed?
Thank you, Gina. And again, thank you, everyone. We're getting questions in. I want to remind everyone, please put your questions in the Q&A feature. I know some people put their questions in the chat, and we're mostly going to be going through the Q&A. We'll be using the chat a little bit later, but I want to verify put questions in the Q&A area. It's a little easier so we have them all in the same place. All right. So aside from requirements for how to do the training, OSHA does give a fairly detailed list of topics to cover during training. The main categories are truck-related topics and workplace-related topics. Now remember, OSHA does require you to include information on that forklift standard 1910-178 as part of the training. That can be easy to overlook, and of course, a good way to approach it is during that classroom portion of the program. So then, as we go over the truck and workplace related topics, keep in mind if a topic does not apply to your vehicles or your workplace, you don't have to train on it. So, for example, if you don't have any ramps or inclines in your facility, your operators don't need training on that, or if there's no hazard atmosphere environments or something like that. Now, the way the standard is written, you might want something to back up and justify your decision to skip a topic, just in case an OSHA inspector asks about it. So maybe you put down a written statement that a survey of the workplace found that there are no ramps or facilities in the are no ramps or inclines in the facility, so that's why you didn't train on it, and you can sign and date that statement. And it's a just in case kind of thing. All right, so the truck related topics are shown here, and we're going to continue on the next slides. And I'm not going to go over every one of these, but we did want to list them out for you. And honestly, much of this information can be found in the forklift operating manual. OSHA expects forklift operators to have training on the information in the manual. Doesn't mean you have to carry the manual around on the truck, but they should at least know where it is. So, for example, providing instruction on the differences between a forklift and an automobile is a good idea because operating a forklift feels completely different from driving a car. And no, you don't need a driver's license to get a forklift operator license. We get asked that a lot. Your new forklift operators, though, they might be used to driving a car, and their initial expectations could be that, hey, driving a forklift is just like driving, but I can tell you for certain it is not. All right, so here's the rest of that list. You'll notice that you have to train on capacity and stability, including the stability triangle. And again, on the operator's manual, again, we get questions on access to the manual. OSHA does not require that you keep it on the truck. I think it'd get dirty or fall off. And in fact, it doesn't specifically require you to provide employee access to the manual, but it does make sense to have that available. And of course, if you do any in-house maintenance or repairs, your mechanics are going to want to be able to refer to that manual also. Now, a lot of these truck related topics lend themselves to the practical part of the training program. It's easier to demonstrate how the controls work and show them the capacity plate rather than trying to describe that during a classroom lecture. But you can still introduce these topics in the classroom portion, and then it's more of a specific review when you get out there and easier to answer questions sometimes in the classroom. All right, now let's get into the workplace specific topics. And a lot of these are unique to your facility. So, training videos and other products, they can cover things like inclines, but it's not quite the same as your workplace necessarily. So videos and other training materials, they're valuable additions to your program. Employees will learn a lot from them, but you will need to verify that you've covered all the specific information and hazards in your workplace as your operators are running in that area. Now, trainees must successfully complete the formal and practical portions. How you determine that success is completely up to you. For the classroom portion, you might give a written test or a verbal test or otherwise evaluate their knowledge. We get asked how many questions can they get wrong? Well, that's entirely up to you. For the practical training, of course, the trainee must be able to safely perform the operations that they're going to use on the job. All right, so far, everything we've said about training applies to initial training for new operators. But this slide also leads us to a discussion on refresher training and on avoiding duplicative training. Sometimes you get a newly hired forklift operator who has experience, maybe with a previous employer. So as we'll discuss shortly, OSHA does allow you to accept previous training, but generally experienced hires, even if someone's been driving a forklift 20 years, they're still going to need training on the workplace specific topics and situations unique to your operating environment. And with that, I will turn back to Gina to cover refresher training.
Yes, thank you, Ed. So many people ask if forklift training is required annually. And I'm here to say that it is not required annually. Instead, OSHA requires refresher training to be conducted whenever any of the situations listed on this slide arise. So it could be because the operator was observed operating the vehicle in an unsafe manner. That would trigger the need for refresher training. Or it could be because there's an incident or a near miss. Safety issues could be uncovered during a performance evaluation, or the operator is assigned to drive a different type of truck. So, for example, if you have an operator who's trained on a sit-down rider versus a stand-up truck or an order picker or something else, operators need to be trained on each type of forklift that they will be operating. Another reason refresher training may be necessary is if you have a condition in the workplace that changes in a manner that could affect safe operation of the truck. So the example that Ed used earlier, if your workplace does not have any ramps or inclines, you don't necessarily need to train your operators on that particular topic. Now, if your facility does upgrades or there's been changes or there's recent construction or something like that, where now all of a sudden you do have ramps and inclines at your facility, well, that would be a cause for refresher training, at least on that portion of the training, at least on that topic. So these are the reasons that you would need to do refresher training for your employees. It is not required annually. Some employers choose to do that as a best practice, but from an OSHA perspective, it's not necessarily required on an annual basis. Okay, so with that, when we're talking about training, if you are interested in accessing additional free resources and content on today's subject, you are in luck because since JJ Keller Compliance Network is sponsoring today's event, we have decided to offer limited time access to all of the content and resources within the platform. So with your access, you will get tailored stream of content that is, helping you understand the regulatory compliance requirements, helps you manage this aspect of your business easier than ever. So you should see a poll on your screen, and all you have to do is indicate your interests in the areas where you may need some additional support, and we will offer you that complimentary access. Okay. All right. So we also would like to move on to our next discussion here, our next topic that we want to cover here. And as we mentioned before, OSHA does give you a break when an operator has received training in the past. So when it comes to that duplicate training, you don't have to duplicate training in topics that were covered in previous training. This applies to new hires as well as to refresher training. But there are always going to be truck specific and workplace specific issues that the employee will need training on. So, for example, let's say that an employee turned sharply while driving too fast and the load fell from the forks. Now, this incident obviously calls for a need for refresher training and some reminders on safe operating procedures. And even though the operator had previous training on steering stability, load handling, a review of these topics is needed. But OSHA doesn't expect you to cover something unrelated like battery recharging in this refresher training session. So you really only need to provide refresher training on the topics that are relevant to that situation. Now, in addition, regardless of the driver's training background, OSHA requires that each employer evaluates each operator prior to allowing them to operate in your workplace. So if you hire someone who has experience, they've already, received training from somewhere else in the past, you as the current employer still have to provide that official certification that they are allowed to operate in your workplace, and you have to evaluate them prior to allowing them to operate. So just some things to keep in mind when we're talking about previous training and duplicative training. Okay, so performance evaluations. As we mentioned earlier, an evaluation of the operator's performance in the workplace must be conducted at the time of initial training. And an evaluation is also required to determine the effectiveness of any refresher training. So if you do have to provide refresher training for any reason, again, talking about safe operating procedures, how to avoid tipping hazards, that sort of thing, you do still need to do an evaluation after you've done the refresher training. You must also conduct an evaluation at least every 3 years. And this is where I think a lot of people get confused on the requirements for refresher training. But OSHA says that you have to evaluate your operators at least every 3 years. It doesn't mean that you have to provide refresher training at least every 3 years. Again, some employers may choose to do that. It is fairly common in the industry, might be a best practice, but at a minimum, you do need to be evaluating your operators at every 3 years. A key point to note here is that this evaluation must be more than just a written or verbal test. So the employer must observe the operator in action performing all tasks related to running the forklift. And of course, the evaluation must be conducted by someone who, again, has that knowledge, training, and experience to evaluate the truck operator's competence. So sometimes these evaluations, can last over the period of a few days if these operators are operating multiple types of forklifts, if they are operating, in multiple different areas, that sort of thing. So you want to really make sure that you are providing a solid evaluation of their competency at least every 3 years. Now, another common question we get is if OSHA requires giving operators a wallet card or a license. Federal OSHA does not require a license or a wallet card. Again, it may be somewhat common in some industries, although employers are not required to do this. Wallet cards do help your supervisors to quickly determine what type of equipment employees have been trained on. Can also enforce to your operators, just how critical forklift operation is. So having something that's tangible that lets someone know, yes, you can operate this equipment, or no, you haven't been qualified to operate this equipment, it can go a long ways and it can say a lot. So even though federal OSHA doesn't require it, it may not be a bad idea for employers to issue these certification cards. Now, OSHA only requires that the employer certify the training has been done. And this simply means, placing a record on file that the training and the evaluation was completed, along with the operator's name, the date of the training, the date of the evaluation, and the names of the persons who performed the training and evaluation. So again, if you have multiple trainers involved, where maybe one trainer is doing the classroom portion and you have another trainer, maybe an experienced operator, doing the field evaluation aspect of it, make sure you're capturing the names of all trainers involved. Now, there's no requirement to give the operator any documentation, at least not from federal OSHA. But kind of going back to the wallet card discussion, there may be some states that do have this as a requirement. So, for example, if you have operations in the state of Michigan, the Michigan OSHA does actually require issuing of a wallet card. So that's covered under Michigan's regulations, their OSHA regulations. It's R408.12154. So if anyone in here is from Michigan, just do keep that in mind. And there may be other states that do have other variances from the federal requirements. This is just one common example that we like to share with our audience. All right, with that, I'm going to pass it back to Ed, and he's going to talk about forklift maintenance.
Thank you again. And maintenance questions do come up. Of course, if a truck is not safe to operate, you take it out of service immediately. And then if repairs need to be done, only an authorized person should perform them. Generally, the operator has not been trained to do repairs, and they're probably not authorized by the employer to do that. Of course, repairs shouldn't be made where there's flammable gases or vapors present, or combustible dust, or other easily ignitable fibers. These are known as your class 1, 2, and 3 locations. So do be careful of fire hazards when working on the fuel or ignition systems, and be aware that electric forklifts have their own set of hazards. Also, do use replacement parts from the manufacturer. They should have the proper parts. We have seen issues when employers tried to use a more generic part and it doesn't quite fit. And also, operators should not alter the truck by adding parts that were not approved. You do need to get permission from the manufacturer, or so I think we're talking about this, a professional engineer can approve it. But things like adding counterweights or even just adding lights and things like that are technically modifications to the forklift. All right, inspections. So in this section, we're going to answer some questions like what are the OSHA requirements? What does the inspection consist of? When do you know if an issue warrants taking the vehicle out of service? And do inspections have to be documented? Oh, we get that one a lot. So OSHA does require that equipment be inspected daily prior to use or after each shift if they're used around the clock. The reg does say after the shift. Usually the next person does it at the start of the shift. That's a somewhat vague requirement, and I think that's why we get so many questions. So for how to inspect, well, first, check the manufacturer's recommendations because every truck is going to have specific features and unique inspection needs. Generally, an inspection should consist of two parts. First, the operator would do a pre-start visual check, and this is with the key off. Then the operator will perform an operational check with the engine running. So let me get a little more detail there. So for that pre-start on your screen here, some common items that are general to most forklifts. And again, these are not in the OSHA standard. They are based on recommendations in OSHA's online forklift e-tool. And of course, a lot of these things appear in most operating manuals, fluid levels, of course. So you want to check fluid levels, leaks, cracks, defects, pretty much all parts of the forklift that you can check with the engine off. And give some close attention to tires and fork condition, anything that could really jeopardize safety. And note that you know, most general items, these are most the general items for most forklifts. Again, there's going to be additional items like say for an electric forklift or an LP gas fueled forklift. And those types may require additional PPE for the inspection. With electric forklifts, there's potential for battery electrolyte exposure. And of course, if you're changing the cylinder on an LP gas forklift, there could be a risk of freeze burn. So make sure employees have the personal protective equipment needed. All right, when we've done our pre-start inspection, then we're going to conduct an operational inspection. This is with the engine running, and this typically includes items like the drive control, lights, horn, brakes, and the other items you see on this slide. Make sure everything's working. Even something like a non-functioning horn or a light not working does require removing the equipment from service for repair. You can't just, I actually talked to one guy who did an OSHA inspection and he said the forklift driver was yelling honk honk at intersections because the horn wasn't working. He said, no, that's not good enough. And again, aside from these items we've been talking about, check the manufacturer's recommendations as well. Each truck, of course, is going to have unique features and may require unique inspections. All right, so if you're doing the daily inspection, are you keeping records? Well, believe it or not, OSHA does not actually require that you document your daily inspections or even do them in writing. And that, of course, means the related question we get, how long do we keep the records? Well, there's no record retention time. You can document them, but there's no retention period. Now, obviously, even though it's not required, Using a checklist, whether it's electronic or on paper, it's a good idea for a couple of reasons. First, it ensures that all essential features of the vehicle are inspected. It'd be easy for someone to overlook or forget something. And it can help provide evidence to an OSHA compliance officer that the vehicles are in fact being inspected as required. By the way, if you want to keep them, my best answer is 6 months because OSHA has a 6-month statute of limitations to issue a citation. So if it's been more than 6 months since you did an inspection, if you missed a day, they can't cite you for that anyway. All right, back to Gina to talk about attachments and modifications. I know this is one of her favorites.
Thank you, Ed. Yes. So, as mentioned, we're going to be moving on to attachments, modifications, and we'll answer questions about things like getting manufacturer's approval, what to do if the manufacturer rejects your request for additional modifications. And we'll also talk about personnel platforms, which is a topic that I think I mentioned earlier, we get a lot of questions on. So, let's dive in. Here's one of those things that trips people up a lot. So OSHA requires that manufacturer written approval for additions or modifications that affect capacity and safe operation. This is one of those, hot topics. So OSHA has interpreted this pretty liberally to cover anything from warning lights to personnel platforms. So if you plan on adding to or modifying your powered industrial trucks, you must get the manufacturer's prior written approval and then should change the capacity plates and any operating instructions accordingly. So there can be a lot that goes into that. But what do you do if the manufacturer says no or simply doesn't reply at all? And as you can imagine, that's pretty common for the manufacturer not to. Not to give a response at all, or even simply say, no, we don't approve this type of modification. And that, again, that happens a lot, and OSHA does address it. So in a April 1997 letter of interpretation, OSHA said that if an employer seeks written approval from the manufacturer for modifications or additions to a forklift and the manufacturer says no, or if they don't respond, then OSHA will accept a written approval of that modification or addition from a qualified registered professional engineer. So you can get a PE to sign off on whatever addition or modification you're making if the manufacturer says no, or if they simply don't respond. Now, the PE must perform a safety analysis and address any safety or structural issues contained in the manufacturer's negative response prior to granting approval. Also, make sure that you change the equipment's data plates accordingly, because that is the main thing that OSHA will be looking for modifications. So moving on to personnel platforms, also known as man baskets or work platform cages. OSHA says that the platforms are considered attachments, and so therefore these too would require the manufacturer's written approval before using them. So that's the first thing to consider, is that we're talking about adding a platform to equipment such as a sit-down forklift, directly to the forks, and not just using equipment designed to lift personnel like order pickers. This does not apply to order pickers. It does not apply to, again, aerial lifts and scissor lifts that are not covered under the forklift powered industrial truck standard. But once you've determined that it's okay with the manufacturer, then you have to deal with the safety issues. So we have fall hazards. Fall hazards are obviously a major concern, so workers must be protected either by guardrails or by a personal fall arrest system. So in addition, the platform itself needs to be secured. Otherwise, it can tip off or slide off, and obviously that's not a situation we want to expose our workers to. In addition, the operator needs to remain at the controls, and they need to exercise caution during operation. So the OSHA regulation doesn't really get into the details of using personnel platforms, but OSHA has referenced the industry standard, the ANSI industry standard. It's B56.1. And that provides quite a bit of guidance on fall protection and using secured personnel platforms and procedures for elevating personnel on forklifts and powered industrial trucks. The B56.1 standard is copyright, so we can't really share too much in depth on that here, but I do encourage anyone who, uses attachments like this for lifting personnel on their forklifts to take a close look at that and make sure that you are following their guidelines and procedures for elevating personnel. Ed, before we switch gears and talk about operating a forklift, how about we engage our audience with one more poll question?
Sure thing. I got another poll here. We've already talked about refresher training, but we're wondering if have you ever had to deliver refresher training after any one of these situations, like an accident near miss, observation, doing something unsafe, maybe the 3-year evaluation found problems. Maybe you've got 2 or more of these. And honestly, I tend to find that these are pretty high. So if you've done those situations, go ahead and make your selection. And while you're doing that, I can share a personal experience. I was a forklift driver back in the 1990s. And so we're well past any statute of limitations on that. But I can tell you when you're doing things unsafe, I mean, I had done things like raising the tines before I came to a complete stop in front of the rack, or carrying unstable loads that were bouncing around and I really shouldn't have been carrying. So these are the kind of things you can observe they're doing things unsafe. And I was in college back then. I didn't really have refresher training on that, and I didn't really cause any accidents. But yeah, these are things where you get observations, and we don't want to wait until there is a near miss, right? We don't want to wait until somebody gets injured or almost gets injured. So if a supervisor sees someone doing something unsafe, they'd better be able to recognize that. They'd better be able to report that up the line. And then the supervisor might not be the one doing the refresher training. As Gina said, it's got to be someone who's qualified as a forklift trainer who gives that training. Maybe training is not the solution here. There might be other issues involved, but OSHA does, at least address it. All right, so we've got the results up here. Uh, okay, half of you, just about 2 or more of these, and quite a few of you on the accident or near miss, doing something unsafe. Yeah, I think a lot of you, with the fact that half of you who have responded have done this for 2 or more situations is pretty impressive. Yeah, there's always some reason to do some kind of retraining here. So that is really good feedback. And if you're one of those people out there going, oh my gosh, I've got such terrible forklift operators, I'm constantly retraining. Well, apparently you're not alone. There's a lot of your peers attending today have found 3-year evaluation problems almost 20% of the time, and found observations, accidents, or other things quite frequently. So I know that's not encouraging, but at least we know it's pretty common. So, all right. So operations here. You can see on this slide, we're just going to have a few questions we want to address. Now, in particular, some unorthodox uses of forklifts, and of course, the common speed limit or pedestrian safety questions. We get that a lot. Leaving the truck unattended. I had a question about that just this morning. And then, of course, a little bit on operating on ramps and inclines. So let's get going on some of those. So I want to start with split forking and bulldozing. Now, split forking is when you lift 2 pallets using 1 fork each. And in the case of bulldozing, it means pushing a load on the floor with the forks. Now, OSHA says those 2 practices could result in any number of hazards. First, forklifts are probably not designed to lift and move loads in the split forking or bulldozing manner. And of course, OSHA requires that employees receive training on any operating instructions, warnings, precautions, or prohibitions in the operator manual. So if the manual says do not do that, then that has to be included in the training. And of course, pushing a load around the ground, well, your loads are supposed to be stable and safely arranged. And again, depending on the equipment or conditions, these practices could result in problems. So there's a letter of interpretation from 1999 that addresses this. I will tell you, one of the other violations I saw was using a dumpster as a snowplow to move snow out of the way. I think that's kind of similar to bulldozing, but boy, that is not the intended use of the truck. Speed limits. What about this? Well, OSHA doesn't have specific speed limits for powered industrial trucks. They do generally address it in paragraph N1 of the standard by requiring operators to follow authorized plant speed limits. Of course, a lot of forklifts don't even have speedometers. So, in determining what is a safe speed, well, OSHA would take a variety of factors into account, and they're listed here: the truck type, pedestrian traffic, stopping distances. Now, Okay, of course, a specific speed limit, if that's not available, OSHA will consider the circumstances surrounding the totality of the operation in determining whether safe speeds are being practiced. Very often, that might just be a walking speed or not much more. And again, as Gina mentioned, ANSI standard B56.1 does have some formulas that can help you determine the speed in a facility. But again, a lot of it is if you're at sprinting speed or going high speed, you might be pushing too quick. And again, it depends on the situation. All right, another source of confusion lies with ramps and inclines. We get quite a few questions about this. With a typical sit-down forklift, you will always point the forks uphill when you are carrying a load. And it doesn't matter if you're going uphill or downhill, regardless direction of travel. So going up the incline, operators will drive forks pointed upgrade and use a spotter if you can't see the room you're going into. And then when going down the incline, you'll drive in reverse. So the forks are still pointed upgrade. Now that's when carrying a load. On the other hand, if you are traveling without a load, the fork should point downgrade regardless of direction of travel. So again, you'll go you'll go down driving forward, and if you're going up the ramp, you're going in reverse. Now, that's for a standard sit-down forklift. It's a little different with a pallet jack. If you've got a powered pallet jack, the forks should be pointed downgrade regardless of the direction of travel and regardless of whether or not there's a load. And now we're getting near the end and we're going to get to your questions. I see you've been sending them in. I'm going to turn it back to Gina to wrap things up a little bit, and then we'll turn it back to Alan and our producers here to get us going.
All right, thanks, Ed. Yeah, so we've covered quite a bit today. Just to recap a couple of the key items here. Remember, if it moves material other than earth and is powered, then there's a good chance that it falls under OSHA's 1910-178 standard for forklifts and powered industrial trucks. Um, Obviously, training is a major issue, and we want to make sure that we're conducting the training with the formal instruction, practical training, evaluation, and certification refresher requirements. There's also very strict requirements for inspection and maintenance. We talked about kind of this, a lot of the safe operating procedures and kind of some of the key things that you need to include in your training. We also talked about manufacturer approval and when that comes into play with things like attachments and modification. So we covered quite a bit of ground. Ed, do you have one more poll for us before we get to questions?
I am going to put up one more poll with a little assistance from our host, and we hope you've gained some valuable information. But before we take your questions, we'd like to thank our event sponsor, JJ Keller Compliance Network, for making today's event possible. Businesses are subject to a lot of regulations across many industries, and we designed Compliance Network to help the safety professional by putting relevant content, tools, and resources directly in your hands. Valuable features include word-for-word regulations, educational resources, and direct access to experts like Gina and I. You can send in a question and you will get a response within one business day. So use the poll to select your interests on the screen and if you'd like complimentary access to this cloud-based solution. And as a thank you, we will email you our popular white paper on forklifts, safe operation and training. It's a good one. You do not want to miss out on that. With that, I'm going to turn things back over to our moderator and we'll get to your questions shortly.
Well, thank you so much to you both for this wonderful presentation and for sharing your insights with us. Before we start the Q&A, we want to remind everyone of the evaluation survey we're asking you to complete. The survey will open in a different screen after this webinar. And your input is important because it does help us improve our future webcasts. Okay, let's get to some questions. First one is for Gina. Are there any major differences in the PIT regulations for 1910 general industry and 1926 construction?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are not any differences between construction and the general industry requirements. The construction requirements follow exact same for general industry. The construction regulations actually just point directly to the general industry standard, so there's really no differences. But that's a great question, so thank you.
This next question is for Ed. Do trainers themselves need to be trained on powered industrial trucks before they can train others?
I wanted to grab that one, and I may let Gina chime in too. But yeah, as Gina said, a trainer must have the knowledge, training, and experience to operate to train others and evaluate their performance. You must have had experience operating that type of equipment. So if as a trainer, I've operated a sit-down counterbalance lift, I can train on that. But if I've never operated an order picker, I can't train other people to operate an order picker. So you would have had at least some training on how to use the new equipment. And I think if you we talked about attachments. Gina talked a lot. If you're bringing in an attachment, maybe it's even a manufacturer provided personnel lift, whatever. If your trainer has never used that, you might need a third party trainer to come in, train the trainer and maybe one the first operator so that they get some experience with that. Gina, anything to add?
Nope, you answered it perfectly, Ed. That's exactly correct. Thank you.
Next question is for Gina. Does refresher training need to be immediate due to an incident, or as in the driver can't operate until refresher training is passed, or does it depend on the situation?
Yeah, I saw this question come through, and it's a great question. OSHA does not directly answer that in the regulations. I would be curious to see if they have a letter of interpretation on this, but my instinct is that it's going to be up to the employer to determine, the timeline and, when and where and how they're going to do the recertification and all of that. But OSHA doesn't really address that timing of that refresher training specifically in the standards.
Our next question is for Ed. If you have a DUI, can you still drive a powered industrial truck?
And that's entirely up to the employer. And I grabbed that because a DUI is for, moving violations. It's a state requirement on roads. And I mean, you could even have enough DUIs or speeding tickets that your driver's license has been suspended, and the state does not want you to drive. Theoretically, you can still operate a forklift. I mean, the situations are actually quite different. Obviously, if you as an employer have an individual coming in intoxicated or hungover, alcohol in their breath, you probably don't want them doing a safety sensitive position, and you might question their judgment. But just having a DUI or even losing your license does not mean you can't drive a forklift at work because you're not driving it on public roads. So they're really not comparable.
This question is for Gina. OSHA requires refresher training for a few different reasons. Can the refresher training be customized per the reason for the training, like an incident versus a new type of forklift, or does the refresher training need to be standardized regardless of reason?
Yeah, that's a great question. So refresher training is going to be based on the topic or the reason that initiated that refresher training. So I think I gave a couple of examples during the presentation. But if your operators need refresher training on one particular aspect of operation, they do not need to sit through the entire refresher training program. So it's going to be dependent on what caused them to need that refresher training. And as long as you at least cover that, then that will meet the requirements from OSHA.
This question is for Ed. Are there any vision requirements in the OSHA standards?
Oh yeah, and there was a related one to that. I mean, people do ask about hearing impairments. So OSHA doesn't have anything in the standard. They have said that the employer needs to make sure that the employee is capable of operating safely. There's a letter of interpretation on that from many years ago, but it's addressing that OSHA doesn't specifically say 20/20 vision or 20/40 vision or whatever, or hearing level. So it's really up to the employer. Now, there is the Americans with Disabilities Act, and some state similar laws may require making accommodations for employees with limitations. I can tell you, I have done some of the HR side. If you can make an accommodation that allows the individual to perform safely, uh, you can let someone with a hearing, vision impairment, whatever, you can let them operate the forklift. However, the ADA does not require you to make an accommodation that would involve a direct threat, which means there's a significant, basically, there's a risk of serious harm to the employee or others. So, even an employee with, say, only one eye, has misting an eye or has no vision in one eye, by awareness, they might still be able to operate safely. But as you run them through the program, if there are issues, you might decide they can't operate safely. So it's really up to you, but you're going to want to work with your human resources department on any possible accommodations and what's reasonable and what might not work.
Sure, you all get a lot of these kind of questions, but this one is for Gina. Does a Kubota side-by-side fall under the OSHA general industry standards?
Yeah, great question. Side by sides, four wheelers, other ATVs, other earth moving equipment do not fall under the OSHA standards for powered industrial trucks. Again, the standard itself covers very specific types of fork trucks and powered industrial trucks. Side by sides, four wheelers, ATVs are not covered under the regulation.
Questions for Ed. Can the 3-year evaluation just be a hands-on driving evaluation?
Well, the 3-year evaluation is usually a combination of asking the operator pertinent safety-related questions. Uh, and you can choose what those are. It might be related to your speed limits or how to go up a ramp or things like that. And then it involves observing the person perform typical tasks in the workplace. So yeah, you are going to observe them operating. And as Gina said, if they operate different types of lifts, you may have to do multiple evaluations. And I know we did a poll on this once where some people have dozens of forklifts and dozens of operators. So you might be doing your evaluations pretty regularly, but you do want to observe them actually performing routine tasks and make sure they're doing that safely. One of the thoughts I had too was I know a lot of people will come out and say, okay, it's time for your evaluation and I'm going to be watching you and stand there with a clipboard. I have to wonder if you're getting a little bit more safety conscious operator activities at that time than if you were kind of sneaking into the facility and watching them go just for about an hour on a normal day. But that's up to you on how you want to observe it.
This question is for Gina. How was the 3-year recertification performed?
Yeah, and I think this question goes hand in hand with everything that Ed just covered as far as, that 3-year evaluation. You're going to go out and do an observation. You're going to have conversations with them. Um, you should have be prepared. So have a list of, the different operators that need this evaluation, the types of forklifts and powered industrial trucks that they operate. So you may need to, depending on how many there are, you may need to, kind of really schedule this in throughout the course of several days or even a couple of weeks, depending on your facility. But really, it's just observing that employee operating in your workplace, doing their routine tasks. And, it's more than just, okay, go out, watch them for, a couple of minutes and move on to the next person. Like you really want to make sure that you're observing them doing especially high risk activities that they are normally required to do, in your regular operating conditions.
Oh, and I got to throw in there if they're using attachments, Gina, would you?
Yes. Yes. Yep. You would want to observe that as well. Thank you.
Next question for Ed is again, it's about a specific type of potential PIT. As our EVS staff uses ride-on cleaners, would those meet the definition of a powered industrial truck?
Like a cleaner, I think you're thinking like a floor cleaner, and no, I don't believe that is a powered industrial truck because it's not designed to move or lift or carry material. And we think about lifting and obviously forklift, we think the tide's going up, but even those pallet jacks, powered pallet jacks, they don't really lift, but just off the floor, but they are still considered a powered industrial truck. But a floor cleaner is not a material mover, and I don't believe that would be covered by the PIT standard. You still want to do some training on how to use it safely, but it's not under the PIT standard.
Question is for Gina. How long does OSHA require the company to keep evaluation paperwork or proof of evaluations?
So you're going to want to maintain the training records for as long as the employee is operating forklifts at your facility. So if you have employees who are operating forklifts, powered industrial trucks for 5, 10, 20 years, make sure that you keep those records on hand for the length that the employee is employed by your company and is expected to operate those as part of their job duties.
Looks like we have time for one or two more questions, perhaps. Ed, does adding blue lights to the lift require written permission from the manufacturer?
Actually, it does. I know that seems odd, but I actually spoke with a safety professional and they operate in a dusty environment. So they had a particular classification of forklift, and the blue light was also rated for that environment. So they called the manufacturer and said, "Are you okay with us adding this?" And the manufacturer said no. They're not going to take on the liability that someone's putting on a light or installing it improperly or wiring it improperly. Like Gina said, there's really no upside for them. But even something like adding that light would require approval, and we should go to the manufacturer first. If they refuse permission or they refuse to answer, then you can go to a professional engineer or something like that and get your approval that way.
I think this looks like our last question. Can you discuss the intersection of reasonable accommodation and safe operation of powered industrial trucks? I think we mentioned this earlier. This is to follow on are there vision requirements? Also, if I have someone who's hearing impaired, can they operate? What if they're missing a limb? That sort of.
Yeah, that's all. Talk to your HR department. It's under Americans with Disabilities Act, and again, sometimes there's state laws that are a little more restrictive, but you're going to have to accommodate. And again, if they really can't do it or would be too risky and cause a safety hazard, you don't have to certify them, but you do have to go through the process and at least look at it. What you cannot do from an ADA standard is say, "Oh, you have a vision impairment, you're not qualified." That's going to get you in trouble because you didn't even look, you didn't even give them a chance.
Well, thank you, everyone. Unfortunately, we have run out of time today. Thank you all for all these fantastic questions. Really appreciate it. And thank you so much to our awesome presenters, Gina Godin, Ed Zaleski, the entire team from our sponsor, JJ Keller, and of course, all of you who joined us today. Take care and have a safe day.